Could a single glance truly condemn a woman to fire? What hidden forces turned a healer into a royal threat? This is the tragedy of Agnes Simpson, the witch who was killed for looking at a king. But how did this begin? First, we have to ask the question of why did a violent sea storm convince King James VI that witches were after him? In October 1589, the North Sea erupted in unnatural fury, battering the royal fleet, carrying Scotland's young king to collect his Danish bride. Wave after towering wave crashed against the wooden hulls, splintering masts and drowning sailors as James watched his wedding voyage transform into a watery nightmare. The king's ship limped back to port, defeated by forces that seemed far too deliberate, too targeted to be mere weather. Across the water in Denmark, Anne of Denmark's own journey had been similarly cursed. Her ships, too, had been driven back by impossible storms that struck with surgical precision whenever royal sails appeared on the horizon. The Danish court whispered of witchcraft, of covens gathering in smoky chambers to conjure tempests from cauldrons and cursed dolls. Soon, Danish authorities were dragging suspected witches from their beds, extracting confessions of weather magic and royal assassination plots under the persuasion of red-hot iron and the rack. These confessions crossed the North Sea faster than any storm, reaching James's court like infection. Here was a king already haunted by his own mortality, a ruler whose paranoia had been sharpened by years of noble conspiracies and assassination attempts. The Danish witch trials offered him something seductive, a tangible enemy for his deepest fears. If witches could command storms, if they could strike at kings across vast oceans, then every shadow held potential threat. Every unexplained misfortune became evidence of supernatural conspiracy. James's superstitions merged with his political insecurities, creating a perfect storm of royal terror. The king who had once written poetry now penned treatises on demonology, convinced that Satan himself had declared war on his crown. What had begun as weather became the foundation for Scotland's most brutal witch hunt. And in the eye of this gathering storm stood a woman whose only crime would be existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. How did a respected healer, Agnes Simpson, become the eye of this storm? In the coastal village of Netherkirk, where salt winds carried both fishing nets and whispered prayers, Agnes Simpson moved through her world with the quiet authority of someone who understood life's most intimate mysteries. She was a woman shaped by loss, widowed young, childless, yet somehow transformed by grief into a keeper of other women's hopes. Her cottage, nestled between the kirk and the harbor, became a sanctuary where desperate mothers brought their laboring daughters and worried wives sought remedies for ailments that male physicians dismissed or simply could not comprehend. Agnes possessed what the community recognized as the gift, not witchcraft, but something far more dangerous in the eyes of suspicious men: competence. She knew which herbs could ease a difficult birth, which poultices could draw infection from wounds, which teas could calm a fever or settle a restless mind. Her knowledge came not from books, for she could barely read, but from generations of women who had whispered their secrets from mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice, creating an invisible network of healing that existed parallel to the official world of male authority. In an age when women who knew too much were automatically suspect, Agnes's reputation walked a knife's edge. The same skills that made her invaluable, her ability to predict difficult births, her uncanny success with herbal remedies, her knowledge of the human body's hidden workings, also marked her as potentially dangerous. Neighbors spoke of her second sight, her ability to sense illness before symptoms appeared, her strange success with cases that had defeated other healers. Were these gifts divine inspiration, natural talent, or something darker? The folklore surrounding Agnes grew with each successful treatment. Stories circulated of her appearing at bedsides in dreams, of her knowing things she shouldn't know, of her herbs working with suspicious effectiveness. Yet these same whispers were spoken with gratitude, not fear, at least until the storms began to rage and King James began to see witches in every shadow. In Scotland's rigid Presbyterian society, women like Agnes occupied a precarious position. They were tolerated, even celebrated, when their knowledge served the community's needs. But the moment political winds shifted, the moment paranoia infected the royal court, these same women became convenient scapegoats for forces beyond anyone's control. Agnes Simpson, the healer of Netherkirk, was about to discover that in a world ruled by fearful men, Being useful was no protection at all. But what happened inside Holyrood Palace the night Agnes looked at the king? The great hall of Holyrood Palace stretched before Agnes Sampson like a cathedral of shadows, its stone walls flickering with the light of 100 candles that seemed to make the darkness dance rather than banish it. She had been summoned here not as a healer, but as a curiosity, one of several suspected witches brought before King James VI as part of his growing obsession with the supernatural forces he believed threatened his crown. The legend that would seal her fate began with something as simple and human as a glance. As Agnes was led into the royal presence, her eyes, those same eyes that had gazed with compassion upon laboring mothers and fevered children, met those of the king. It was a moment that lasted perhaps a heartbeat, yet in that instant, courtiers would later claim, something passed between them. Not words, not gestures, but a look that James himself would describe as penetrating, knowing, almost intimate in its intensity. What had Agnes seen in that brief exchange? Perhaps she recognized in the king's face the same fear she had witnessed in his countless patients, the terror of someone who believed death was stalking him. Maybe her healer's instincts read the signs of sleeplessness, paranoia, and deep spiritual torment that marked James's features. Or perhaps she simply looked at him as one human being acknowledging another, unaware that such directness from a woman of her station would be interpreted as witchcraft itself. The court buzzed with whispered interpretations of the encounter. Political enemies of the king's current favorites saw opportunity in the moment, transforming a simple exchange of glances into evidence of supernatural communication. Courtiers who had witnessed nothing but two people looking at each other suddenly remembered sinister details. The way Agnes's eyes had seemed to glow, the strange smile that had played across her lips, the unnatural stillness that had fallen over the hall during their brief visual contact. In a world where royal paranoia intersected with patriarchal fear of female knowledge, Agnes Sampson's crime was not what she had done, but what she had dared to see, and what others claimed she had revealed through seeing it. Why did silence hurt more than screams in Edinburgh's darkest cell? The toll booth of Edinburgh squatted like a stone cancer in the heart of the city, its walls thick enough to swallow sound and hope in equal measure. Into this fortress of despair, they dragged Agnes Sampson, the healer who had dared to look upon a king, her wrists already raw from the iron shackles that would become her constant companions. The arrest had come in the dead of night, as these things always did, when darkness could hide the faces of neighbors who turned away rather than witness what befell women who knew too much. The instruments of her interrogation had been waiting in the cell like patient predators. The branks, that devilish contraption of iron and leather known as the witch's bridle, was designed not just to inflict pain, but to rob its victim of the most human of abilities, speech. 4 iron prongs pressed against Agnes's tongue and the roof of her mouth, while a spiked chain circled her head like a crown of thorns. Every attempt to speak, to protest her innocence, to cry out in agony, drove the metal deeper into her flesh. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of drowning, of suffocation, of a voice being murdered by degrees. King James himself descended into these depths, his scholarly interest in demonology transforming the royal presence into something far more sinister than any traditional execution. He came not as a king dispensing justice, but as a theologian conducting research, his questions probing not just for confession, but for the intricate details of diabolic practice that would confirm his theories about the supernatural war being waged against his crown. The king's voice, cultured and precise, asking about sabbats and demons while Agnes bled from iron wounds, created a grotesque parody of academic discourse. The psychological torture proved more devastating than the physical. They denied her sleep, rotating guards who would shake her awake the moment her eyes closed, creating a waking nightmare where reality and hallucination blurred together. They stripped her not just of clothing, but of dignity, subjecting her to the humiliating search for the devil's mark that male examiners claimed to find in every mole, every scar, every imperfection of her aging body. The woman who had once moved through her community with the quiet confidence of a healer now cowered naked before men who found evil in her very flesh. Days stretched into weeks in the toll booth's embrace, each hour measured not by the sun she could not see, but by the steady drip of blood from her wounds, and the rhythm of questions that never changed, never stopped, never offered any path to freedom except through the confession that would damn her. In this place where silence was torture and speech was death, Agnes Simpson began to understand that her fate had been sealed not by anything she had done, but by the simple act of being a woman who had lived too fully in a world that demanded her surrender. What secrets would you invent to make the pain stop? In the suffocating darkness of her cell, as the iron branks cut deeper grooves into her swollen tongue and the sleepless nights blurred into a single endless torment, Agnes Simpson began to understand the terrible mathematics of survival. Each lie she told bought her a moment's respite from the instruments of interrogation. Each fictional detail about sabbats and demons earned her a cup of water or a crust of bread. The confession that would damn her was not a revelation of truth, but a masterpiece of desperate creativity born from unbearable suffering. The words that spilled from her bleeding lips painted a Scotland crawling with supernatural conspiracy. She spoke of midnight gatherings in the kirkyard of North Berwick, where 200 witches had allegedly danced around the church in a great circle, while the devil himself preached from the pulpit. She named names, fellow healers, midwives, women who had shown her kindness, neighbors who had sought her remedies, weaving them into a tapestry of imagined evil because each new accusation seemed to satisfy her tormentors' hunger for more victims, more proof of the vast conspiracy they believed surrounded their king. The confession that most delighted James was her detailed account of the storm-raising ritual. Agnes described how the witches had taken a cat, christened it in the devil's name, and bound it to the dismembered parts of a dead man before casting the grotesque charm into the sea during the king's wedding voyage. She spoke of wax images of the royal couple, of needles driven through their hearts, of incantations designed to drag the king beneath the waves. Every word was fiction, yet every word was delivered with the conviction of someone who had learned that only in fantasy could she find escape from the reality of her torment. King James listened to these revelations with the fascination of a scholar discovering new species of evil. He took notes, asked follow-up questions, probed for details that would confirm his theological theories about the nature of diabolic pacts. The confession became a collaboration between torturer and victim, with Agnes learning to anticipate what her audience wanted to hear and crafting her lies accordingly. When James showed particular interest in weather magic, she elaborated on storm-raising techniques. When he pressed for details about the devil's appearance, she painted vivid pictures of horned figures and sulphurous breath. The most heartbreaking moments came when Agnes implicated women she had genuinely loved, the fellow midwives who had shared their knowledge, the neighbors who had trusted her with their secrets, the daughters who had learned healing at her side. Each betrayal was a small death, yet each betrayal was also a prayer that perhaps, if she gave them enough names, enough details, enough confirmation of their fears, they might finally let her die with whatever remained of her dignity intact. But can evidence exist when every witness is invisible? The trial of Agnes Simpson unfolded in Edinburgh's courthouse like a theatrical performance where the audience knew the ending before the curtain rose. Scottish witch law, that peculiar marriage of Presbyterian theology and royal paranoia, had created a legal framework where the impossible became admissible and the invisible carried more weight than flesh and blood testimony. Agnes stood before her judges not as a defendant in any recognizable sense, but as a woman whose guilt had been predetermined by forces she could neither see nor comprehend. The prosecutors needed no human witnesses when they possessed something far more compelling: spectral evidence. They spoke of dreams where Agnes had appeared to torment her victims, of night flying that left no footprints, of curses that traveled through the air like invisible arrows. The woman who had once healed with herbs was now accused of killing with thoughts, of commanding storms from hundreds of miles away, of conspiring with demons who left no trace of their presence except in the fevered imaginations of the terrified. How could mortal advocates defend against charges that existed beyond the realm of physical proof? Agnes faced her accusers without legal counsel, for Scottish law deemed witches unworthy of defense. The judges who would decide her fate were the same men who had crafted the charges against her, creating a closed circle of condemnation where appeals to logic or evidence were not merely futile, but considered further proof of diabolic influence. When she attempted to recant her tortured confessions, her words were dismissed as fresh evidence of the devil's power to make his servants lie even about their own guilt. The spectacle drew crowds who packed the courthouse galleries like theater-goers hungry for entertainment. The common people of Edinburgh, worn down by economic hardship and religious fear, found in Agnes's trial a perfect distraction from their own suffering. Here was a woman who had allegedly consorted with the devil himself, who had raised storms against their beloved king, who represented everything dangerous about female knowledge and independence. The crowd's murmurs of approval whenever fresh evidence was presented created a soundtrack of communal bloodlust that made reasoned deliberation impossible. Weather magic formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, with learned men explaining how witches could bind winds in cloth, command lightning from clear skies, and direct tempests with supernatural precision. The very storms that had driven back the royal wedding fleet were presented as evidence of Agnes's guilt, as if the North Sea itself had testified against her. In a world where natural disasters demanded supernatural explanations, Agnes Simpson became the human face of forces that mortal minds could not otherwise comprehend. Why did the crowd cheer as the wind died down? The morning of Agnes Simpson's execution dawned gray and bitter, with Edinburgh's winter wind cutting through the assembled crowd like a blade-seeking bone. At Castle Hill, where the city's gallows stood like a permanent reminder of royal justice, the pyre had been carefully constructed, not just of wood and kindling, but of symbolic meaning that would transform a woman's death into a public lesson about the wages of defying God and King. The ritual began with the shaving, that final humiliation designed to strip away not just hair, but the last vestiges of human dignity. Agnes's graying locks, once pinned beneath a healer's cap, fell to the cobblestones like autumn leaves, exposing a skull marked by months of torture and sleepless nights. The crowd watched in fascination as the woman who had once commanded respect in her community was reduced to a trembling figure whose naked scalp bore the fresh wounds of the branks that had silenced her voice. The executioner's assistants worked with practiced efficiency, painting Agnes's shaved head and body with tar that would ensure the flames caught quickly and burned hot. The black substance, thick and choking, transformed her into something inhuman, a creature of pitch and shadow that bore little resemblance to the midwife who had once brought life into the world. Around her neck, they placed the garrote, that merciful device that would strangle her before the fire could reach her flesh. Though mercy was a relative concept, in a world where burning alive remained the legal punishment for witchcraft. Legend claims that Agnes spoke final words from the pyre, though what she actually said, if she said anything at all, remains lost to history. Some accounts suggest she maintained her innocence to the end, while others claim she warned the crowd about the devil's continued presence in their midst. More likely, the woman whose tongue had been pierced by iron prongs and whose voice had been stolen by months of torture died as silently as she had been forced to live in her final weeks. The torch was applied as the winter sun reached its weak zenith, and the flames that consumed Agnes Simpson flickered against a sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down upon the city like a divine judgment. The crowd's cheers rose with the smoke, celebrating not just the death of a woman, but the defeat of forces they believed threatened their very souls. As the wind died down to an eerie stillness, as if nature itself were holding its breath, the people of Edinburgh convinced themselves that they had witnessed justice rather than murder, salvation rather than sacrifice. What curses lingered after the flames were gone? The ashes of Agnes Simpson had barely cooled when Edinburgh's appetite for witch blood grew ravenous, fed by the intoxicating taste of sanctified violence. Her death became not an ending, but a beginning, the first drop of blood that would stain Scotland's hands for generations to come. Within weeks, the names she had screamed under torture became warrants for fresh arrests, and the women she had implicated in her desperate fantasies found themselves dragged from their beds to face the same iron bridles, the same sleepless nights, the same impossible choice between truth and survival. The economic machinery of fear ground into motion with terrifying efficiency. Accusation became currency, denunciation a path to social advancement, and the property of condemned witches flowed into the coffers of those who had condemned them. The fear that had once protected communities by encouraging conformity now poisoned them from within, turning neighbor against neighbor and daughter against mother. Every unexplained illness, every failed harvest, every sudden death became potential evidence of supernatural malice, and the methods perfected on Agnes Sampson were refined and repeated on countless other women whose only crime was existing in a world that had learned to profit from their destruction. Yet, even in death, Agnes Sampson refused to disappear entirely. In the years that followed her execution, she transformed from historical figure into folk legend, becoming the wise wife of Keith in ballads sung by traveling minstrels and ghost stories whispered around winter fires. These tales, passed down through generations of women who remembered her healing touch more clearly than her forced confessions, preserved a version of Agnes that the Kirk and Crown had tried to erase: the midwife who had eased suffering, the healer who had understood the mysteries of life and death. The most devastating legacy of Agnes's destruction was the systematic dismantling of the informal networks of female knowledge that had sustained communities for centuries. Midwifery, herbalism, and traditional healing, the skills that had made women like Agnes valuable, became suspect practices that invited scrutiny and death. The wisdom that had passed from mother to daughter for generations died with the women who carried it, leaving behind a Scotland where female authority had been branded as witchcraft and female knowledge as diabolic conspiracy. Agnes Sampson's only true sorcery was living at the crossroads of fear and power. What other glances in history have been punished as crimes we still don't understand? Subscribe for more untold tales where legend and truth collide.